Here's something nobody in that mall could explain afterward. Why did she know exactly which direction to push him? Not left, not backward, not down. She pushed him forward, rotating his body 17 degrees off-center, and that specific angle is the only reason James Jackson's brain is still inside his skull today. You don't do that by accident. You don't do that in a panic. You do that because you ran the geometry in your head before you ever stepped through those doors. But we'll come back to that. First, ask yourself something. We talk about invisible people all the time, the ones who sleep in doorways, who push carts along median strips, who hold cardboard signs at off-ramps. We look through them the way you look through a window, not at them, through them. And the question worth sitting with, the one that should bother you more than it probably does, is this. What if that's exactly what someone wanted you to do? What if invisible was the most sophisticated security clearance in the world? Now here is what the footage actually shows. James Jackson, and if you don't know that name, understand that certain industries in certain cities run smoother because he allows them to, was moving through the atrium of a luxury mall on a Thursday morning. Pinstripe suit, 6 bodyguards, the quiet, pressurized calm of a man who has not been surprised since he was 19 years old. She came out of the crowd's blind spot. Green coat, knit beanie, boots with the sole separating at the toe. The kind of woman that James's security had been unconsciously filtering out their entire careers, because their training told them the threat would arrive in a different package. Their training was wrong. She crossed 12 feet of open marble in the time it took 2 guards to register she was moving. And when she hit him, open mall, full atrium, eye cameras on every angle, the sound dropped the room into total silence. James went airborne, rings and all. The glass behind him detonated half a second later. And here's the thing. Here's the part that should make the back of your neck go cold. In the video, if you slow it down, if you watch frame by frame, right before she throws the punch, she doesn't look at James. She looks up. She already knew where the bullet was coming from. So go back to the question I planted at the beginning. Why did she know exactly which direction to push him? The answer will change everything you think you understand about what a mother is capable of when she has spent 15 years watching her son from the gutter, mapping every threat, memorizing every rooftop, paying the price of invisibility so that one day, one specific day, she could be exactly where he needed her. She didn't save James Jackson because she got lucky, or she saved him because she never stopped being his mother. And he was about to find that out in the worst, most beautiful way possible. The Scottsdale Fashion Square had a particular kind of quiet on Thursday mornings. Not silence, the mall was never silent, but a curated hush, the sound of money moving at a relaxed pace. Heels on Italian marble, the low chime of a Nordstrom elevator, the whispered consultation between a sales associate and a client who hadn't checked a price tag in years. Or it was the kind of atmosphere that cost something to maintain, and everyone inside understood that instinctively, even if they couldn't articulate it. James Jackson understood it better than most. He moved through the atrium the way he moved through everything, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had not been made to wait since his early 20s. His suit was Keton, charcoal with a faint chalk stripe, and cut in Naples and altered twice by a tailor in Georgetown who kept no public appointments. His watch was a Patek Philippe Nautilus in rose gold, the kind of piece that other wealthy men noticed immediately and said nothing about. 6 members of his security detail moved in a practiced constellation around him, close enough to be useful, far enough to be invisible. He had come for one thing, a bracelet, 18-carat white gold, set with Paraiba tourmalines the color of the Caribbean, from the Van Cleef and Arpels boutique on the upper level. His goddaughter's graduation gift. Even men who ran empires built on ruthlessness had soft spots, and James had learned long ago that acknowledging his made him more dangerous, not less. He was moving past the ground floor fountain, Arizona sunlight cutting through the skylights above, turning the water into scattered diamonds, when his lead guard, a former Army Ranger named Devlin, touched his earpiece and angled slightly left, descanning the upper balcony. It was a micro-adjustment, the kind James had learned to notice over 2 decades of living inside security bubbles. Nothing confirmed, just the antenna of a trained man picking up a frequency nobody else could hear. James did not break stride. He was 3 steps past the fountain when she materialized from the left. But as she came from the part of the crowd that his team had been unconsciously discounting since they entered, the part that didn't belong in Scottsdale Fashion Square on a Thursday morning, or any morning. The coat was olive green, military surplus, the kind of garment that had been through actual weather and hadn't recovered. A dark knit beanie sat low over grey-streaked hair. Her boots were cracked at the seam. She was moving through the parting crowd with a focus so absolute it didn't register as aggression until it was already too late to process as anything else. Devlin was still looking at the balcony. She crossed the marble in 4 strides. James had exactly enough time to register her eyes, grey and ferociously calm, before her fist connected with his jaw and the world tilted hard to the left. He hit the floor the way large, and powerful men always do when they fall unexpectedly, with a totality that shocked everyone who witnessed it, including himself. The marble came up to meet him with the indifferent authority of physics. His Patek struck the floor a half-second later. Somewhere behind him, a woman screamed. Then the glass exploded. The storefront of the Mont Blanc boutique, 3 feet behind where James's head had been standing, detonated outward in a single violent exhalation, so sending a cascade of shattered crystal across the marble. Display pens scattered like spent ammunition. The steel security gate buckled inward. The sound arrived after the visual, the way lightning and thunder separate over distance. Except there was no distance here. It happened in the same breath. The atrium stopped. 200 people froze in the specific, primitive stillness of prey animals registering a predator they cannot yet locate. Then the screaming began in earnest, and the freeze dissolved into chaos. Bodies moving in every direction, bags dropped, phones raised, children pulled by the wrist toward exits. Devlin had James by the collar before the echo died, dragging him behind the concrete base of the fountain, one hand already drawing the weapon at his hip. The other guards collapsed inward in a practiced formation, scanning high and fast, the Mont Blanc boutique smoking in their peripheral vision. James pressed his palm flat against the marble and felt the cold of it anchor him to the present moment. His jaw pulsed, his ears rang with a high, clean note that slowly descended into something he recognized as silence, the specific silence of a near miss of physics that had gone differently than intended. He looked up. She was already being forced to the floor by 2 of his guards, arms wrenched behind her back, her cheek against the same marble that had caught him. But even in that position, pinned, outnumbered, completely at the mercy of men who answered to nobody but him, she was not struggling. She was completely still, and she was looking directly at James, not with fear, with relief. Still listening? I need you to subscribe right now and hit that like button if you haven't. They moved her through a service corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner and recycled air, the kind of passage that exists behind every luxury environment to keep its machinery invisible. Devlin had her by the arm, not roughly, but with the categorical firmness of a man who did not make exceptions. 2 more guards bracketed the rear. James walked ahead, his Keaton jacket hanging open, his jaw darkening along the left side, where the bruise was already beginning to establish itself beneath the skin. His Patek had survived the fall without a scratch. He noticed that with the detached corner of his mind that always kept functioning regardless of circumstances. $38,000 of Swiss engineering, and it hadn't even lost a second. They exited through a loading bay on the east side of the building into the full weight of the Arizona afternoon. The heat was immediate and total, the kind that Phoenix delivered in May without apology. A row of delivery vehicles sat idle along the service road, somewhere 2 blocks north, and sirens were converging on the mall's main entrance. Devlin had already been on the phone twice. The sniper position had been identified, a maintenance alcove on the 3rd floor of the parking structure directly across from the Mont Blanc boutique. Abandoned. Professional. The kind of setup that took days to arrange and seconds to vacate. James turned around. She was standing between his 2 guards with her wrists held at the small of her back, or the olive coat dark with perspiration at the collar, the knit beanie still pulled low. Up close, in the flat honesty of daylight, the years were written on her in a language that required no translation. The skin around her eyes carried the particular weathering that came not from age alone, but from exposure, from seasons spent without adequate shelter, from sleeping in positions the body was never designed to hold. Her hands, where he could see them at her sides, were calloused at the knuckles and dry at the joints. James looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once at Devlin, and Devlin released her arms and stepped back 6 feet with the other guards, far enough to provide the illusion of privacy without compromising containment. "You're going to tell me," James said, "exactly who sent you, and you're going to do it in the next 30 seconds, because after that, this conversation changes character in ways that will not be comfortable for either of us." His voice was even. It was always even. He had spent a long time cultivating that particular quality, the ability to deliver absolute intent without raising the temperature of his delivery. Men who shouted their threats were men who needed the volume to convince themselves. James had never needed convincing. The woman looked at him. Not up at him. She was taller than he had registered in the chaos of the atrium, and she held whatever remained of her posture with a straightness that the coat and the boots and the exhaustion couldn't entirely erase. She took one breath, and then she said his name. Not James, not Mr. Jackson, not the 6 other names that various people in various cities used when they needed his attention. She said the name his mother had used, the one from before Scottsdale, before Georgetown, as before the Partick and the Keaton and the 6-man security detail. The name from a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago, where the radiator knocked all winter and the windows fogged, and a woman with gray eyes had called her son something small and specific and entirely private, a name that had existed between exactly 2 people on Earth, and one of them had been lowered into the ground at Rose Hill Cemetery in Cook County, Illinois, 15 years ago. James stopped breathing. The name hung in the Phoenix heat between them like something physical, like an object that had been stored in the dark for a decade and a half and had just been placed, without warning, into direct sunlight. His mind ran the calculation the way it always ran calculations, rapidly, methodically, checking variables. The accent. The specific music of it, the South Side Chicago vowels that no amount of years in any other climate could fully erase. The cadence of the sentence. The way she had weighted the second syllable, the same way she always had. The particular frequency of it, which he had not heard in 15 years and which his nervous system apparently still had indexed somewhere beneath conscious thought, because his body had responded before his mind had finished processing. His hands were still. His face was still. But something behind his eyes had changed irrevocably, like the way a foundation changes the moment the first crack propagates, invisible on the surface, catastrophic underneath. The woman in the tattered coat looked at him with grey eyes that were steady and devastated in equal measure. "It's me, baby," she said quietly. "It's Mom." And James Jackson, who had not wept in 15 years, felt his throat close around something that had no name in the vocabulary of the life he had built. Devlin had found a black Escalade idling 2 blocks east, and they were inside it within 4 minutes of leaving the loading bay. James and Vanessa in the rear, a partition of tinted glass between them and the 2 guards up front, the Phoenix skyline sliding past the windows as the vehicle moved without any particular urgency through the afternoon traffic on Camelback Road. James had said nothing since the loading bay. He had simply looked at her for a long time with an expression that had no category, and then he had turned to Devlin and said, quietly, that they were leaving. That was all. Now he sat with his forearms resting on his thighs, his rose-gold Nautilus catching the light at intervals, and he watched the woman beside him, the way you watch something you are not yet certain is real. She had accepted the bottle of water one of the guards had produced without comment. She held it in both hands. She did not drink from it immediately. She seemed, he noticed, accustomed to holding things carefully. The bombing, James said finally. It wasn't a question. It was the beginning of an accounting. Vanessa turned the water bottle once in her hands. The Delgado family had been watching you for 8 months, she said. You were 26. You'd just taken the Chicago territory north of the river, and you'd done it faster than anyone had expected, which made you more dangerous to them than they'd planned for. She paused. They couldn't get to you directly. Your security was already good by then, so they looked for the other way in. James said nothing. I found out on a Wednesday. She continued. A man I'd known from the old Englewood neighborhood came to me. He was frightened. He told me what they were planning. Not to hurt me. To take me. To use me as the instrument that would bring you to a location of their choosing, without your guards, without your preparation. She looked at him evenly. You would have come. We both know that. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. They both knew it was simply true, the way certain mathematical facts are true. Not because anyone decided them, but because the logic runs in only one direction. I had 72 hours, she said. I used them. What she had done in those 72 hours had required a precision that James, even now, with the full capacity of his admiration available to him, found difficult to fully absorb. She had located a woman, a Jane Doe, already gone, a hospital in Cook County, no family, no record of consequence, whose physical dimensions approximated her own. She had called in 15 years of accumulated neighborhood trust, the kind of social currency that exists only in places like Englewood and cannot be purchased anywhere else. She had arranged the vehicle. She had arranged the fire. She had arranged, and with the help of a funeral director who owed her a debt she had never previously collected, the documentation that had closed the case before it was properly opened. The service at Rose Hill had been real. The grief had been real. The closed casket had contained someone, just not her. I watched from across the street, she said, and for the first time her voice shifted slightly, the way a load-bearing wall shifts under weight it was built to handle but never wanted to carry. You wore your father's watch, the one with the cracked crystal. You never cried. You just stood there at the graveside with your hands at your sides, and I thought... She stopped, recomposed. I thought that you looked exactly like him, and that I was doing the right thing. James looked out the window at the desert periphery of Phoenix beginning to replace the commerce of Scottsdale. Saguaro cacti standing at indifferent intervals against the blue sky. Arizona had no interest in anyone's grief. He had always appreciated that about it. You've been here, he said. All this... Not always here. I followed where you went. She said it without drama. Chicago for 4 years after. Then when you moved operations to Vegas, I was in Nevada. When you opened the D.C. corridor, I was in Virginia. Maryland for a while. The streets in Bethesda are surprisingly manageable in autumn. A pause. I came to Scottsdale 8 months ago. When I heard about the Castellani conversation. That landed differently. James turned back to her. You have sources, he said slowly. I have 15 years of being invisible in cities where your enemies talk freely, she said. You would be surprised what people say in front of someone they have decided doesn't exist. He studied her, the cracked boots, the weathered coat, the hands that had spent a decade and a half operating without the protection of the name she had given him. She had traded everything the world offered for a vantage point in the gutter, and she had held that position without relief, without recognition, and without ever once asking him to know. James Jackson had built an empire on the principle that loyalty was purchased and therefore finite. He was being asked, without a single word of request, to revise that entirely. The safe house was a property James kept under a Nevada LLC in the name of a man who had died in Reno in 2019, a clean, undocumented death with no outstanding associations. The house itself sat on 2 acres at the edge of Paradise Valley, where the lots ran large, and the neighbors had learned, through long practice, the particular Arizona virtue of not concerning themselves with other people's arrivals or departures. The architecture was mid-century modern, all clean horizontal lines and floor-to-ceiling glass, the kind of structure that looked meditative from the outside and functioned, when necessary, or as something considerably less peaceful. Devlin had the living room configured as a command post within 30 minutes. Laptops open on the restoration hardware dining table, encrypted phones in rotation. A second team had been dispatched back to the mall's parking structure, and they had returned with photographs, measurements, and a single spent casing that told a precise and unhappy story. James stood at the glass wall overlooking the pool, his jacket finally removed, his sleeves rolled to the forearm. Vanessa sat on a stone-colored linen sofa behind him, a mug of black coffee held in both hands, wearing a white Loro Piana robe that one of the guards had located in a closet upstairs. The contrast between the robe's immaculate cashmere and the boots still on her feet, which nobody had thought to address, and which she had not volunteered to remove, said something about the distance between where she had been and where she now momentarily was. Devlin cleared his throat from the dining table. The casing is Lapua Magnum, .338 caliber. He set a photograph on the table without looking at it. That's a precision load. Minimum 800-meter effective range, purpose-built for a single high-value target. This wasn't opportunistic. He paused. The setup in that parking structure took no less than 48 hours to establish. Someone had the location, the schedule, and the patience. James turned from the window. The Castellanis. Devlin nodded once. Our contact in the Nevada office confirmed it an hour ago. The order came out of their Philadelphia operation 6 days ago, funneled through a logistics contractor they've been using for East Coast work. The same contractor connected to the Baltimore situation in February. He picked up one of the encrypted phones, turned it face up on the table. There's more. James waited. The contract wasn't singular, Devlin said carefully. It was dual. There were 2 names on it. He glanced briefly toward the sofa, then back to James. They know she's alive. The room absorbed that quietly. Vanessa did not react visibly. She lowered the coffee mug to her knee and looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone receiving information they had long ago accepted as eventual. James turned that over in his mind with the methodical patience of a man who had learned to process bad news without the luxury of panic. The Castellanis knowing about Vanessa meant one of 2 things. Either someone inside his own operation had sold the information, or the family's intelligence network had simply been more diligent than he had credited. Neither answer was comfortable. Both required immediate response. How long do we have before they recalibrate? He asked. The contractor missed confirmation on the primary contract 6 hours ago. Devlin said. Standard Castellani protocol after a missed confirmation is 72 hours before they activate a secondary approach. He paused. That's assuming they follow their own protocol. After today, I wouldn't assume that. James walked to the dining table and stood over the photographs without touching them. The spent casing, the alcove in the parking structure, the sightline drawn in red marker on a printed aerial view of Scottsdale Fashion Square. Someone had spent 6 days planning to remove him from the world, and the only reason they had failed was that a woman in a cracked pair of boots had spent 15 years developing an intelligence operation that his own people, with all their resources, had never come close to replicating. He straightened up. "Get me Hargrove," he said. "Tell him I need 2 seats on the earliest available commercial departure to London Heathrow. Separate booking, no connection to the LLC, nothing that routes through our usual channels." He looked at Devlin. "First class. Her name goes on nothing. She travels on the documentation I keep in the Denver deposit." Devlin was already moving. James walked back to the glass wall and looked out at the pool, the desert evening beginning to settle over the Valley of the Sun in gradients of amber and rose. The water was very still. The Patek on his wrist read 6:47. He had perhaps until Thursday to disappear, and he turned back to his mother. She was watching him over the rim of the coffee mug, and her grey eyes held something he hadn't seen directed at him in 15 years. Not relief, not gratitude, but the quiet, absolute attention of a woman who had never once stopped watching over her son, even from the bottom of the world. "You'll need shoes," he said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The memory of one. "I've managed without," she said. "Oh, not anymore," he replied. They boarded at Terminal 4 of Phoenix Sky Harbor just before midnight, moving through the priority lane with the unhurried efficiency of 2 people who had agreed, without discussion, to perform normalcy as a discipline. James wore a charcoal Brunello Cucinelli overcoat over a dark roll neck. No jewelry except the Patek, his face carrying the composed neutrality of a man accustomed to being watched in public spaces. Vanessa moved beside him in a camel-colored Max Mara coat that one of Devlin's people had sourced that afternoon, along with soft leather ankle boots from a Scottsdale boutique that she had accepted without comment and worn with the careful attention of someone reacquainting themselves with comfort they had long stopped expecting. She looked to any observer like a woman of quiet distinction. A professor, perhaps. A retired diplomat. Someone with history behind her eyes and no obligation to explain it. They did not look like a mother and son. They had agreed on that too, without words. Flight 209 to London. Heathrow departed 11 minutes late, climbing out over the dark geometry of the Arizona desert before banking northeast and finding its altitude above New Mexico. James had the window. Vanessa had the aisle. The seat between them, in the 6-seat first-class cabin, held 2 glasses of still water and a silence that had weight and texture and needed for the moment to simply be endured. The cabin crew moved with the practiced discretion of people trained to be present without intruding. The seats were Lufthansa's new business configuration, wide cream leather, the kind of engineering that turned 11 hours into something a human body could survive with its dignity intact. James declined the dinner menu. Vanessa accepted it. I studied it for a long time, with the focused attention of someone reading something in a language they once spoke fluently and were now carefully recovering, and ordered the Dover sole. He watched her eat. He couldn't help it. She ate slowly, deliberately, the way people eat when they are reminding themselves that there is no reason to rush. It was the most precise documentation of 15 years that he had witnessed. More than the boots, more than the calloused hands. The way she held her fork told him everything about the distance she had traveled to sit in this seat tonight. "You're staring," she said without looking up. I'm looking, he said. There's a difference, in your case, that I'd be skeptical of. He almost smiled. Almost. The New Mexico darkness gave way to the flatness of the Texas panhandle far below, invisible in the night, except for the scattered amber grids of small towns doing their small-town business, and entirely unaware that a man with blood on his ledger and his resurrected mother were passing 38,000 feet above them on borrowed time. I need to ask you something, Vanessa said. She had set down her fork. The Dover sole was half finished. And I need you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way you've trained yourself to receive things. James turned from the window. When we land, she said, when you've done whatever it is you're planning to do with the Castellanis, and I know you're planning something, James. I've watched you plan things since you were old enough to arrange your toy soldiers in tactical formations on the kitchen floor. I need to know what happens. She paused. I need to know what you're willing to let happen. He was quiet. I didn't spend 15 winters on the streets of 4 states, she said, and her voice was even, measured, a voice that had made its peace with what it was saying long before this conversation, so that I could watch you respond to this the way you've responded to everything else. She looked at him directly. More bodies, James, more contracts, more retribution that generates more retribution until there's nobody left who remembers what the original grievance even was. They put a contract on you, he said. They put a contract on both of us. She corrected. And if you answer it the way you want to answer it, the next contract will include whoever you have standing next to you 6 months from now. That's how this operates. You know that better than I do. She folded her napkin with quiet precision. I am asking you, as the person who gave up everything so you could remain in the world, to find a different answer this time. The cabin hummed around them. Somewhere behind the partition, a passenger had reclined their seat fully and gone to sleep in the absolute, uncomplicated way of people with no outstanding business on the ground. James looked at his mother's hands resting on the tray table. The new boots, the borrowed coat, the 15 years it had taken to get from Rose Hill Cemetery to this seat at this altitude, asking him this question. I hear you, he said finally. It wasn't a promise. They both knew that. But it wasn't a refusal either. And somewhere over the dark breadth of Missouri, at 38,000 feet, that distinction mattered more than it had any right to. It started with the coffee. James had been awake for the better part of 2 hours, the Patek reading somewhere past 3 in the morning, the cabin reduced to the low amber of overnight lighting and the soft, pressurized breathing of sleeping passengers. Our Vanessa had reclined her seat an hour ago and closed her eyes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to sleep in conditions far less accommodating than cream leather at altitude. James had watched the darkness outside his window and let his mind run its calculations in peace. He noticed the flight attendant because she did not pour the coffee. She had approached the galley at the forward partition, lifted the carafe, and then set it down without filling the cup. And a small thing. The kind of micro-behavior that meant nothing in isolation and everything in context. James had built 20 years of operational survival on the architecture of small things. He straightened slightly in his seat. The man in 2A had been asleep, or performing sleep, since shortly after takeoff. He was broad through the shoulders in a way that his canali blazer was not quite cut to accommodate. The blazer was good. The shoulders were a problem. James had catalogued him at boarding and filed him without urgency. He revisited that filing now. Row 4, a woman traveling alone, window seat, who had spent the first 3 hours of the flight reading and had not turned a single page in the last 90 minutes. Row 6, 2 men who had boarded separately, taken seats 3 rows apart, and had not looked at each other once, which was, in James's experience, or precisely how people who knew each other very well behaved when they needed to appear otherwise. 6 seats. 6 people. The same number of moves required to take a cabin of this configuration without structural resistance. He was still running the count when 2A stood up. The transformation was immediate and total. The performance of a relaxed business traveler dissolved in the same moment the man reached into the laptop bag at his feet and straightened with a flat, authoritative calm that James recognized as professional training. The woman in row 4 was already on her feet. The 2 men in row 6 separated and moved to opposite ends of the cabin with the coordinated efficiency of people who had rehearsed this in a room somewhere in Philadelphia. The remaining 2 emerged from the rear. They had been in the economy section, patient, waiting for the signal that had apparently just been given. The forward flight attendant, the one who hadn't poured the coffee, stepped back against the galley wall and did not move. She was not a hostage. She was a 7th piece James hadn't counted. The man from 2A addressed the cabin in a voice calibrated to carry without escalating. He was in his 40s, well-fed, well-rested, the look of a man who had done this before and expected it to conclude professionally. "Nobody needs to be frightened," he said. "The cockpit is secured. The aircraft is continuing on its current heading. We have no interest in the plane or in anyone aboard it." He paused for exactly the right interval. "We have interest in 2 passengers. When those passengers cooperate, everyone else will be entirely comfortable for the remainder of this flight." Vanessa was awake. James didn't need to look to know it. He felt the change in her stillness, the shift from sleep to full alert beside him. The man from 2A looked down the aisle with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been given accurate intelligence and trusted it. His gaze moved along the rows with professional patience and stopped, without drama or error, on seat 1A and 1B. "Mr. Jackson," he said, "and the woman the Castellani family has been looking for since 2010. A brief pause, the kind that was performative rather than uncertain. "The Queen and the Prince. All the way from Phoenix." He offered something that was technically a smile. "You'll both come with us to the rear of the aircraft. This doesn't have to be difficult." James did not move. The cabin held its breath. 3 other passengers, civilians, a couple from somewhere in the Midwest judging by the matching fleece zip-ups now abandoned in their laps, and a younger man with noise-cancelling headphones still around his neck, had come awake into this and were processing it in the fragile, disbelieving silence of people who had boarded a routine transatlantic flight and arrived somewhere else entirely. James felt Vanessa's hand find his forearm in the dark of the seat space between them. Not gripping, just present. A pressure that said, "Remember what I asked you." He looked at the man from 2A. At the 6 points of the formation his team had established through the length of the cabin. At the sealed cockpit door, at the 7-piece problem laid out before him at 38,000 feet over the North Atlantic, with no Devlin, no backup, no options that arrived from the outside. He breathed in through his nose and released it slowly. And then James Jackson did something that the man from 2A had not factored into his preparation. He smiled. The man from 2A did not know what to do with the smile. James could see that clearly. The micro-adjustment behind the eyes, the slight recalibration of posture, and the way a man who is prepared for resistance or compliance finds himself momentarily without a script when he encounters something that fits neither category. It lasted less than 2 seconds. But 2 seconds, in James's experience, was a significant unit of time. "I'll need a moment," James said pleasantly, "to speak with my companion." The man from 2A considered this. "You have 30 seconds. "I'll need more than that," James said, with the same tone he used when renegotiating terms that had been presented to him as fixed. "I'm going to have a conversation. It will take as long as it takes. You'll wait, because the alternative is that this situation becomes considerably more complicated than your employer prepared you for." He held the man's gaze without aggression, without theater, simply with the flat authority of someone who had been the most dangerous person in the room for so long it had stopped requiring effort. "No, sit down." The man from 2A did not sit down, but he did not move forward either, which was, for present purposes, the same thing. James turned to Vanessa. She was fully upright in her seat, the Max Mara coat pulled around her shoulders, her grey eyes moving through the cabin with the same systematic attention she had apparently been applying to his world for 15 years. She completed her assessment and brought her gaze back to him. 6, she said quietly, plus the one at the galley. 7, he confirmed. Cockpit is compromised. We're over the Atlantic. No support, no communication outside what they're permitting. He kept his voice level, the two of them occupying a pocket of relative privacy in the held-breath silence of the cabin. "I need you to understand what I'm telling you when I say I can resolve this. I know exactly what each of those 7 people needs to not do their job effectively, and I know how to deliver it." He looked at her steadily. "But the way I know how to do that, the way I have always done that, is not what you asked me for over the Pacific." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the North Atlantic was invisible beneath cloud cover, 38,000 feet of dark air below them, and London still hours ahead. "You could do it," she said. It was not a question. "Before any of them reached the second row," he said. She looked at the civilians, the couple in matching fleece, holding each other's hands with the white-knuckled specificity of people who had not been in danger before and were discovering what it felt like. The young man with the headphones still looped around his neck, staring at the middle distance with the expression of someone running through every decision that had placed him on this particular flight. Or ordinary people from ordinary American lives who had boarded at Sky Harbor expecting to wake up over England. When Vanessa looked back at James, her eyes were clear. "Then do it differently," she said. "You are the most intelligent person I have ever known, James. You were problem-solving before you could read properly. I watched you dismantle things and rebuild them better when you were 7 years old." Her voice did not waver. "Don't tell me the only tool you have is the one that ends people. I know better. I raised better." Something moved through him that he couldn't have named with any of the vocabulary his life had given him. "If you use violence to save me tonight," she continued quietly, "then my 15 years of silence were in vain. Every winter I spent making myself invisible so that you could remain in the world without being used as a weapon against yourself. That becomes nothing. It becomes the foundation of the next cycle." She reached over and took his hand. Her grip was dry and certain and completely without sentiment. "Save this plane. Save these people. Save yourself. But do it as the man I know you are, not the one the Castellanis made you into." James looked down at her hand over his. The new boots on her feet, the borrowed coat, 15 winters purchased with everything a person could spend and no guarantee of return. He turned back to the man from 2A, who was watching this exchange with the particular impatience of a professional whose timeline was eroding. James exhaled once, slowly, deliberately. The way you release something you have been holding long enough that the muscles have forgotten what open feels like. "All right," he said quietly, to no one but his mother. He straightened in his seat, reached forward and pressed the cabin service button with the unhurried precision of a man ordering a drink. Then he looked at the man from 2A and said, "I'd like to tell you something about the Castellani family that your employer neglected to mention before he put you on this plane." And he began. The man from 2A's name, James had determined within the first 4 minutes of talking, was Doyle. Not because Doyle had offered it, he hadn't, but because the woman from row 4 had glanced at him once with the specific involuntary reflex of someone whose mouth nearly formed a name before their training caught it. James had catalogued that the way he catalogued everything, quietly and without acknowledgement, and filed it for later use. Later use had arrived. The Castellani family, James said from his seat, as in the unhurried register of a man delivering a briefing rather than negotiating for his life, has a succession problem. I'm going to assume Doyle didn't cover that in your preparation. The man from 2A, Doyle, absorbed the use of his name with the trained stillness of a professional, but the woman from row 4 had gone very slightly rigid in a way that confirmed everything James needed to know about where the intelligence leak had originated. He noted it and continued. The patriarch has 2 nephews. One is based out of Atlantic City, the other out of Pittsburgh. They have been in a managed disagreement about the direction of East Coast operations for approximately 3 years. It is managed currently because the patriarch is alive and neither nephew is willing to move while he can still object. James adjusted the cuff of his Brunello Cucinelli roll neck with the unhurried precision of a man at a board meeting. The contract on my life was not issued by the family. It was issued by the Pittsburgh nephew, using family infrastructure, without the full knowledge or authorization of Atlantic City. He paused. Which means that the man who put you on this plane does not, in the strict sense, represent the Castellani family. He represents one half of a family that is approximately 8 months from a civil war. Doyle said nothing, which was, James had learned long ago, the loudest possible confirmation, and he pressed the cabin service button again. The flight attendant at the galley, the 7th piece, looked at him with the flat assessment of someone waiting for a reason to act. He held up 2 fingers and pointed to the overhead panel near the forward galley. The intercom handset, he said. Please. She looked at Doyle. Doyle, after a moment that cost him something, nodded once. James accepted the handset with the same casual ownership with which he had accepted the Van Cleef and Arpels boutique in Scottsdale 2 days ago. He examined it briefly. Standard commercial aviation intercom, cabin-to-cockpit capability, and crucially, patch capability to the aircraft's radio system if you knew the 4-digit maintenance override code, which James did because a pilot he had done considerable business with in Nevada had explained it to him once over a bourbon at a private terminal in Henderson, the way people explain things to James Jackson when they want him to remember them favorably. He keyed the maintenance override without ceremony. What followed was not loud or dramatic. It sounded to the ambient ear of the cabin, like a quiet and technical conversation between a man and an air traffic control authority that had been expecting his call. James constructed the fiction in real time with the attention to operational detail that had made him, over 2 decades, genuinely difficult to outmaneuver. He cited tail numbers, he cited coordinates, he referenced a protocol. Transatlantic Contingency Accord, Article 7, which did not exist but sounded with absolute authority like something that should, under which the aircraft's passenger manifest had been flagged by a joint US-UK interdiction task force currently operating out of a facility in Maryland. He was specific about Maryland. Specificity was the architecture of belief. He let the fictional authority on the other end of the line, his own voice, slightly modulated, answered after a 2-second gap he created by covering the handset and releasing it, confirmed that assets were being repositioned, that the aircraft would be met at Heathrow by a ground team, that anyone aboard who cooperated fully with the existing passenger complement and caused no further disruption would be processed under a witness consideration framework that the Pittsburgh operation was, as of this week, explicitly excluded from. He set the handset down. The cabin was very quiet. The couple in matching fleece had stopped breathing audibly. Vanessa sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and he could feel, without looking, the quality of her attention. James looked at Doyle. The Pittsburgh nephew, he said, sent you to Philadelphia to pick up a contract, then put you on a commercial flight to handle a problem that the full Castellani family does not officially have. When this aircraft lands, the question you need to have answered is whether Philadelphia will still be answering calls on your behalf. He let that settle. The Atlantic City side has been aware of this operation for approximately 90 minutes. I made that call from the safe house in Paradise Valley before we left Arizona. He had not, but Doyle didn't know that. Oh, and the woman from row 4, whose rigid posture had been slowly rearranging itself over the past 12 minutes into something that resembled a person doing private mathematics, was no longer looking at Doyle with the deference of a subordinate. She was looking at him with the careful assessment of someone recalculating where their interests actually resided. James watched that shift complete itself. Doyle felt it too. James could see the moment it registered, the almost imperceptible change in the man's jaw as he understood that the room he'd controlled 4 minutes ago had been quietly rearranged around him while he was standing still. The cockpit. James said simply, "Have your people stand down and open the door. Your weapons go into the forward overhead locker. Everyone returns to their seats." He looked at Doyle with the same even, pressurized calm he'd deployed in the loading bay in Phoenix. "When we land at Heathrow, I will personally confirm to the ground team that your cooperation was complete. What happens after that is between you and whichever Castellani is still returning calls." Doyle stood in the amber overnight lighting of the cabin for a long moment, a professional assessing a situation that had moved beyond the parameters of his preparation. A man built for physical problems, confronting one that had been resolved entirely in the register of information and doubt. He looked once at the woman from row 4. She looked back at him without expression, without loyalty. He picked up the radio at his hip and spoke 2 words into it. "Stand down." Heathrow appeared below them as a vast constellation of organized light, the Thames a dark ribbon threading through the geometry of Greater London in the early morning grey. Our James had watched England assemble itself out of the cloud cover with the particular attention of a man committing a landscape to memory, not because he expected to forget it, but because he understood, with a clarity that had been building since Phoenix, that the version of himself who had last moved through the world at altitude was about to be permanently grounded. The cabin had spent the final 2 hours of the flight in a silence that had its own texture. Doyle and his people occupied their seats with the contained stillness of professionals who had made a calculation and were living inside it. The couple in matching fleece had eventually fallen into an exhausted, leaning sleep, the man's head against the window, as the woman's against his shoulder, the posture of 2 people from somewhere ordinary in America who had survived something extraordinary and would spend years afterward describing it at dinner parties without ever quite capturing what it had actually felt like. James looked at them once and felt something that wasn't quite envy and not quite tenderness, but occupied the territory between the two. Vanessa had been awake beside him for the descent, and she watched England through the window with grey eyes that took everything in and offered nothing back, and James had the sense, not for the first time since the loading bay in Phoenix, that she was running a parallel calculation to his own, the same destination reached by a different route. He had composed the transmission somewhere over Wales. It was not long. James had never believed in length for its own sake. The message went to 4 recipients: his operational director in Chicago, and his financial administrator in Nevada, his legal counsel in Washington, D.C., and Devlin, who would understand it most completely and require the least explanation. It cited without elaboration the airline, the flight number, and the words North Atlantic navigational failure, a phrase that meant nothing to anyone outside his organization and everything to the 4 people receiving it. It instructed the transfer of all operational authority. It directed the dissolution of 2 specific accounts and the activation of a contingency structure he had spent 3 years building in the patient, unhurried way that men who expect to need an exit eventually build one. It ended with a single line, "Tell them the ocean kept me." He sent it at 11 minutes to landing, when the wheels were already lowering and the cabin lights had come up to full and the flight attendants were moving through their final checks with the brisk and transactional efficiency of people ready to conclude a professional obligation. Nobody was paying attention to a man in a dark roll neck doing something quiet on a phone. He powered the phone off and slid it into the seat pocket in front of him. Vanessa was looking at him. "Done?" she said. "Done," he said. She nodded once. The same nod she'd given him, he imagined. At 7 years old, when he'd finished something she'd asked him to do, the nod that was not praise exactly, but was better than praise, because it was acknowledgement from someone whose acknowledgement meant something. The wheels met the Heathrow tarmac with a sound like a full stop. They had discussed the cargo hatch 3 hours ago, in the low voices of the overnight cabin, Vanessa providing the structural detail with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had spent years learning how buildings and vehicles and systems were constructed, because people who lived outside them needed to understand how to move through them without being seen. The forward cargo access, on this aircraft configuration, could be reached through the forward galley service panel during the ground taxi phase, before the jetway connected. A gap of approximately 4 minutes between touchdown and terminal contact. Enough time, if you moved without hesitation, for 2 people to be somewhere other than where the manifest said they should be. They moved without hesitation. The tarmac was cold and flat and smelled of fuel and English morning, and James helped his mother down the last meter of the access ladder with one hand and felt the ground come up through the soles of his shoes. Solid, specific, European, new. She landed beside him and straightened up and looked out across the apron at the grey Heathrow morning without any expression he had a name for. He stood beside her. No Devlin, no Keaton jacket, no 6-point security constellation moving in practiced orbit around him. The Patek was still on his wrist. He had kept it not from vanity, but because it had been his father's watch before the crystal cracked, and his mother's face had looked at him across a Chicago kitchen and told him to wind it carefully. Some things you kept. Not because they were expensive, because they were true. Around them, the machinery of Heathrow continued its enormous, indifferent business. Ground crews in high-visibility vests, service vehicles crossing the apron in purposeful diagonals, the organized noise of a place that processed the arrivals and departures of the world without pausing to consider the specific weight any individual carried through it. James Jackson was dead. The 4 people in Chicago, Nevada, Washington, and Phoenix believed that now, or would within the hour, and they would build that belief into the public record with the same professional thoroughness with which they had built everything else he'd ever asked them to construct. The world his name had occupied for 20 years would close over the absence like water over a stone, and within a season, the stone would be forgotten. What remained was a man standing on an English tarmac at dawn with his mother beside him. Vanessa reached over without looking at him and took his hand. Not the careful, purposeful grip from the seat on the plane. This was something older and smaller and entirely without strategy. The grip of a woman who had held this hand when it was very small and was now simply holding it again, as if the 15 years between were a distance that could be closed by contact. He did not speak. There was nothing yet that words were equipped to carry. They walked together towards the service road at the edge of the apron, 2 figures moving away from the aircraft in the grey English morning, leaving no record of arrival, no forwarding address, no trail that led anywhere except forward. James Jackson, who had been many things to many people in many cities across the length and breadth of America, was none of them now. He was just a son, walking away into a new life, with the person who had always been worth building one for. They found a small flat in a village outside Edinburgh, where the mornings came in slow and grey, and nobody asked questions that weren't their business. Vanessa planted things in the back garden. James learned, for the first time in his adult life, how to be still. Some evenings he wound the old watch with the cracked crystal and set it on the windowsill, and she would see it and understand what he meant by it, and they would sit together without needing to fill the silence. The world had buried James Jackson, but the man who replaced him finally knew how to live.